So a little while ago, I was planning on doing a Bible study on the Last Supper. And I went to YouTube to find something interesting, and I found it. I always warn people, be careful what you find on YouTube, because you don't know how accurate or valid it is. And I heard this wonderful talk, some pastor talking about how you could either believe John's gospel or you could believe Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's, but you could not believe both of them at the same time. And I thought, you know, I've been listening and reading these scriptures since I was 7 years old, and I didn't realize I was so dense as to know that you couldn't believe them both at the same, they're all them at all at the same time. So I sent a text message to Pastor Jay, and I said, okay, tell me where I find the solution to this. And he did. So yeah, there we go. Nope, go to the second slide with all the words on it. There we go. Yeah, I don't think you can read those. But that's where he referred me to. He referred me to a guy by the name of James Kaufman and told me to read his commentaries. Well, James Kaufman, if you could read that, you would be able to see that he was born in 1905, became a Christian in the early 30s, or 23, I'm sorry. He preached in Texas, Oklahoma, Washington, D.C., and New York City. He conducted hundreds of gospel meetings, and at one count had baptized more than 3,000 people. And he retired in 1971 and started writing commentaries on the Bible. And he wrote those from 1971 until 1992, and he finished his 37th volume on the commentary on the Bible. He covered every book of the Bible at that time. And it says most people consider his series to be one of the finest modern conservative commentaries ever written. And James Kaufman gave me some hints as to how to understand the apparent discrepancies that you find between the book of John and the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Next slide, please. And in order to do that, you need to understand something about the Passover, and next slide, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And so when it comes to the Passover, next slide. I don't know why it's taking so long. Here we go, there we go. You find in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 5, in the first month, which by the way is the month of Nisan, in case you care, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And there are some very specific directions as to what to do during the Passover. Next slide. You're getting the next, no, you've got the next slide, but I don't have it here. I guess I'll look up there. Steve, are you on Zoom? Can you go to the next slide? Is this a, well, okay, there we go. Now it's on. Wonder what's happening with my laptop. Okay. Okay, what's do? When you read about the directions on the Passover, you find that you're supposed to slaughter a lamb. You're supposed to put blood on the doorposts. There's very specific foods that you're supposed to eat, and each food represents something different about the Passover. And you're supposed to eat it standing up. And in case you don't remember, the reason you eat it standing up is because you're supposed to be getting ready to flee Egypt. This Passover, the original Passover, was done for the Jews in exile in Egypt who had been in slavery, and they were going to take off. And this was the night before they're going to take off. And of course, someone remind us why we needed the blood on the doorposts. Somebody say it loudly.
So they wouldn't kill your firstborn son.
Who wouldn't kill your firstborn son? The angel of death. There we go. So that's the Passover. So how many of you know that there's another feast called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread? And go to the next slide, which I'll wait for 5 minutes for my laptop to catch up. In the next slide, you'll see that the Feast of the Unleavened Bread is covered in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 26. And it says, on the 15th day of the same month, there is a feast of the unleavened bread of the Lord, 7 days where you shall eat unleavened bread. So God wanted to make sure they got the idea, right? And they had 7 days to practice this. And I just realized yesterday when I went to go buy the matzos for this morning's communion, you know, you can buy a big case so that you can have 7 days worth of matzos. And there are very specific directions as to what to do for the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Next slide. You're supposed to remove any leaven from your house. Now, this doesn't mean just removing the yeast in the pantry or the baking soda or the baking powder. This removes any product in your house that has leaven in it. Any bread, any cake, any, you name it, anything that has leaven in it that rose is supposed to be cleaned out. You're supposed to make new unleavened bread. You're supposed to celebrate, and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread begins and ends with a Sabbath. So there's a Sabbath on the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is the 15th day of the month. And there's a Sabbath on the last day, 7 days later. And obviously, since Feast of the Unleavened Bread starts on the 15th day of the month, and every year that's going to be different, that means that Sabbath does not necessarily occur on a Saturday. It occurs on whatever day fits. So what you need to understand is that the Jewish people got sort of confused and a little bit lazy about these ceremonies. And at first they all celebrated Passover religiously, but then they didn't quite get around to it. And people weren't celebrating the Sabbath, weren't celebrating the Passover. And so the temple people brought it to the temple, and they had Sabbath at the temple. And that way more people showed up and celebrated it. And then they sort of slid together. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread started the day before the feast was the Passover, which technically is another feast, but it sort of all ran together. So with that as preface, why don't we start by reading, next slide, please. We're going to read Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 26. And who has a nice loud voice that's willing to read that for us? And maybe we can have a microphone for that person. Thank you, Mike. Somebody read Mark 14, 12 through 26. Here we go. Les is going to read it. There's the microphone, Les. Okay.
On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher says, where is my guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he himself will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Prepare for us there." The disciples went out and came to the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he came with the 12. As they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be grieved and to say to him one by one, "Surely not I." And he said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl. For the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." While they were eating, he took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take it. This is my body." And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Thank you. So you'll notice the very first verse is on the first day of the unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed. This apostle said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare to eat Passover?" If you look at Luke, you'll find it says, "Now the feast of the unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the scribes were trying to find a way to put him to death." If you look at the account in Matthew 26:20, it says, "Now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And if you look at John, it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing his hour was to come," etc., etc. So each version of the gospel starts with a slightly different choice of words as to what's going on. And there's a reason why that's important in understanding, because if you want to try and understand what was going on, you need to understand, when was this happening? Hang on just a second, I'm getting my own things. So in order to make sure that you can reconcile John with the other three, or understand what's really going on, you need to look at each step of what's going on. And the first step is Jesus tells his apostles to go and prepare. So how long does it take you and your family, your wife primarily, to prepare for Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner or Easter dinner?
4 days.
4 days. You're lucky. Okay, well, they didn't have prepackaged Passover dinners, so your wife couldn't have done that in those days. So the first problem with this scripture is that Jesus tells his apostles that morning to go prepare, and they're going to have dinner that evening. Now, between the morning and the evening, not only do they have to find the house, but they have to slaughter a lamb, and they have to put the blood on the doorpost, and they have to cook the lamb. So you got a lot of work to do in one day, right? So it's a little bit of a challenge if it happens on the day of Passover. And I think it suggests that it doesn't happen on the day of Passover, but I'll leave that up to your own wisdom. The second thing Jesus tells them to do is find a man carrying a pitcher of water. So if it was Passover afternoon that was going to happen, there would be literally thousands of people carrying pitchers of water to their houses for the Passover supper. And how in the world would you identify which man was carrying a pitcher of water? But if it was a couple days before, the chances of finding, a day or two before, the chances of finding a man carrying a pitcher of water was much higher. And in fact, there's some indications that perhaps this Last Supper occurred at the house of the Apostle Mark. Oh yeah, there would have been a lot of people in Passover carrying a piece, but a couple days before you could find a man, and women instead of men, I know. So the next problem that you've got is when they're talking about the Last Supper, the scriptures say that they're reclining at table. Now, if these are people, Jewish people who are following the law, are they eating Passover supper reclining? No, they're eating standing. So that would be another suggestion that this did not occur on Passover day. And there's more. Luke in chapter 23:54, when he's talking about them bringing Christ down off of the cross, He says they went to prepare his body for burial, to get it buried, because it was the day, the preparation day. Now, how could Jesus have died on preparation day if it was Passover? You wouldn't confuse preparation day with Passover. That's like confusing, 2 days before Christmas with Christmas. You just don't make that mistake, right? So there's the next piece, and there's one more piece, I think. They wanted to hasten the death of the people who were crucified. So they went to break their legs so that they would die before the Sabbath, and they could get them down off of the crosses before the Sabbath. Now, we sing in that song, "On a Hill Far Away." The crucifixion hill was not on a hill far away. It was right outside the city gates, and that was on purpose. This was public execution place. You don't have a public execution and then hide it on a hill far away. You put it right where everyone sees it, where everyone going in and out of the temple gates see the people who are being crucified, because that's the whole reason that you're crucifying them, is so that everybody sees that they're being punished for what they did wrong. So this is not on a hill far away. This is right where everyone sees it. And they broke their legs in order to get them off the crosses before the Sabbath, which was going to be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So if you understand all of that, what you really understand is that when the Last Supper occurred was not on Passover. It was at least one day before Passover, and maybe two. So the next part about the Last Supper is Jesus' statement about Judas. Now, everyone knows that Judas was sort of, in some respects, you could call him a victim of fate. Somebody had to betray Jesus for him to go through this process. And if you really read the stories of what was going on the days before the Last Supper and the crucifixion, what did Jesus do that caused all sorts of trouble? He'd done it once before, 2.5 years earlier, and he did it again. He cleansed the temple. He went through the temple and turned over the tables of the money changers and chased them out and chased out the vendors and yelled and screamed how they were defiling the house of the Father. So he did that at the very beginning of his ministry. And you can be sure, if you were one of the chief priests, you were watching this new rabbi and saying, who is this guy? And how dare he go into our temples and turn things upside down? Well, here he is doing it again. How many of you think that was an accident? There were no accidents with Jesus, right? He did it, and he knew he was doing it. And frankly, I think that he knew he was bringing his death upon him, because he was going to make sure they were good and ticked at him. And sure as shooting, within days, Judas is out there talking to the high priest and having his exchange to betray him. Yes, sir.
Sure as shooting. Is that in Luke?
So Jesus' statement about Judas is pretty horrible. It would be better if that man were not born. So Jesus knew, and interestingly enough, when Judas left the Last Supper, his fellow apostles thought he was going out to buy something for the Passover feast. So obviously they weren't having the Passover feast if Judas was out to go buy something for the Passover feast. And actually he was buying Jesus' death is what he was doing. And then the next part of the story is Jesus institutes communion. Now, we could get into this rather lengthy debate, and we could spend the next 4 days here and debate whether Jesus meant these words, symbolically, or he meant them literally. And that's the biggest difference between, one group of Christians and another. But the bottom line is he chose bread and wine as something that we should do for our memorial. And he didn't say, hey, every Sabbath, get together at the temple and have bread and wine and remember me and remember my death. He said, whenever you eat this and whenever you drink this, remember my death. And he chose the most common elements that we have at all of our meals in all societies all over the world. And, and some of you might say, well, wine isn't a very common thing. But if you go back to Jewish days and you have to worry about how clean the water is, and in many societies, how little water there is, and if it's going to be pure enough to drink or not, you realize that wine was a pretty close substitute. People drank a lot of wine in those days, mainly because they didn't have access to clean water all the time. So wine was a very common element in their food, in their meals. And of course, bread was, and in this particular case, it was unleavened bread. So Jesus institutes the communion for the first time, and then it says the group sang a hymn. Now, if this was Passover, there are very clear directions that Passover ended with a very specific hymn called the Hallel. You wouldn't get mixed up singing, oh, they sang a hymn instead of they sang the Hallel. If they sang a hymn, they were not singing the Hallel. And if they weren't singing Hallel, they were not ending the Passover meal. So it becomes very apparent that Jesus' Last Supper was not on Passover. It was at least one day before Passover. And when he died between noon and 3, that was when they were sacrificing the lambs for Passover that night. And just, you know, as sort of an incidental little thing, they figured out that in order to, the capacity of the Jewish temple to sacrifice lambs for enough people between 3 hours, if you used all the chief priests and all of the areas where sacrifices could be taking place, they could slaughter about 18,000 lambs in 3 hours. But the problem was, in order to sacrifice enough lambs for all the people in Jerusalem at that time, they would need to slaughter 250,000, about 250,000 lambs. And so most of the lambs were slaughtered at people's houses, which is where it was supposed to be done, so you'd have the blood to put on your doorpost, right? In fact, I don't know how they got the blood from the temple to their doorposts, how they did the doorpost thing.
Mason jars.
Mason jars, there we go. There we go. So I figured, since we were going to be talking about communion, that today seemed an appropriate day to have communion. And so I have matzos and grape juice, and I have little cups at your table. And if you don't have enough little cups, just raise your hand, and Dawn or Norm or somebody will bring you. I have some extra cups at my table there in case we run short. And Eric is going to come up and lead us in a song for communion, but I'll open it to any questions that anyone may have before we get to that point. Yes, sir.
That's a lot of lambs, 250,000 lambs.
Jerusalem is a big city, and everyone came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Jesus didn't live in Jerusalem. He traveled there for the holiday, the holy day.
How many turkeys do you think they kill on Thanksgiving?
Yeah. Good question. I bet you we could Google that one.
Well, we could too.
Bring the lamps with them to the city.
There's no refrigeration, so they had to do
And
it.
all the families out in the outlying areas to bring their own lambs with them.
I didn't read about that. I'm sure some did, and some went to the temple where they had procured them and things like that. I mean, we think of this as a fairly small backward town, but Jerusalem and the temple operation had to be pretty sophisticated and pretty well organized just to kill 18,000 lambs. Okay, before Eric starts singing the song, I'm going to go back and read the part of scripture about before we have communion, and let me read that part again. Since this is what Jesus directed us to do, is to do this whenever we eat. And while they were eating, he took some bread, and after blessing, he broke it, and he gave it to them. And he said, "Take it. This is my body." And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is the blood of my covenant, blood of the covenant, which is being poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine again until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of heaven." Okay, so why don't you, if you need a cup, raise your hand. And otherwise, why don't we share communion at our tables?
Your hands is in your feet. Tell me how much you love me. Bones on your brow, they tell me how. For so much shame to love. Till the heavens pass away, your scars will still remain, and forever they will say how much you love me. I want to say my love, forever my heart, forever my life is yours. Forever my love, forever my heart, forever my life is yours.